Hi everyone. Tonight we're boarding a ship bound for the single most ambitious city the ancient world ever built. Alexandria. Not the sleepy tourist stop with the beach umbrellas. I mean the original. A city so obsessed with being the smartest place on Earth that it built a library specifically to hoard every book that ever existed, whether the original owner wanted to give it up or not. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe keep one eye open for scholars who might try to confiscate whatever you're reading. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to walk beneath the tallest building on the planet and not immediately trip over your own sandals staring at it? Could you survive a library so possessive it legally seized books from every ship that docked? Would you have made it as a scholar living on the state's dime, debating geometry over free dinner? Or would you have been quietly escorted out for arguing too loudly about the shape of the earth? And could you handle a city so multicultural that you'd hear 4 languages before finishing your breakfast? And now, congratulations, you've just arrived in Alexandria. The year is around 250 BC, the height of its glittering, slightly egotistical golden age. You have no scrolls to your name, a suspiciously confident guide, and the biggest lighthouse in the ancient world is currently staring you down. Good luck. Let's get into it. Your ship eases into the great harbour at dusk, and the very first thing Alexandria does is make you feel small. A structure taller than anything you have ever stood beneath rises from a small island just offshore, throwing a beam of firelight out over black water, like the city itself is trying to make a first impression. You have arrived at the front door of the ancient world's most confident metropolis. And the door, it turns out, is on fire. The harbour itself is a working miracle of engineering, long before you even reach the quay. A man-made causeway called the Heptastadion connects the mainland to the island of Pharos, splitting the water into 2 separate ports, one for the royal fleet and diplomatic traffic, another for the endless churn of merchant vessels hauling grain, timber, glass, and papyrus in and out of Egypt. Somewhere in the gloom, sailors are calling out depth soundings in Greek. Dockhands are arguing in Egyptian over cargo manifests, and a customs official is already eyeing your baggage with the specific, weary suspicion of a man who has seen every smuggling trick there is. You are not being paranoid. He genuinely has. The water itself smells of salt, tar, and fish left in the sun slightly too long, mixed with wood smoke drifting down from the lighthouse fire far above. Torches line the docks, their flames doubled in the black harbour water, and somewhere a horn sounds to signal an incoming vessel, a sound that carries for miles across flat water on a still night. You grip the rail as your ship threads between smaller craft, fishing boats bobbing low and heavy with the day's catch, their crews already heading home for bread and beer, while you are still trying to figure out which direction land actually is. Consider what this harbour represents for a moment, because it is not merely a convenient place to dock. Alexandria was built from nothing, on a strip of coastline chosen specifically because it had almost no natural harbour to speak of, and its founders essentially manufactured one through sheer, stubborn engineering, dredging channels and building breakwaters until the sea agreed to cooperate. It is the ancient equivalent of picking the worst possible plot of land for a housing development and simply willing an entire international airport into existence there through spite and hydraulic engineering. And it worked spectacularly. Within a couple of generations, this artificial harbour became one of the busiest ports in the entire Mediterranean world, funneling grain from the Nile Valley out to feed cities as far away as Rome, while pulling in incense from Arabia, ivory from the south, and scholars, immigrants, and opportunists from absolutely everywhere. Ever tried to squeeze through a crowded airport terminal during a holiday rush, weaving around luggage and families and someone loudly missing their connection? This is that, except the luggage is amphorae of wine, the connecting flight is a felucca, and instead of a departures board, there is a 400-foot tower of fire, helpfully reminding everyone exactly how impressive this city intends to be. You step off the gangplank onto stone quays, worn smooth by centuries of cargo carts, salt spray still clinging to your clothes, and above you, the great light keeps turning its slow, patient beam out over the water, guiding in the next ship, and the one after that, and the one after that, forever, whether anyone happens to be watching or not. Let's talk properly about that lighthouse because it deserves more than a passing glance. Somewhere around 400 feet of dressed stone stands between you and the horizon, a mirror and a bonfire working in shifts to guide every ship for miles toward a harbour that could otherwise swallow a vessel whole on its rocks. Built in 3 tapering sections, square at the base, octagonal in the middle, and cylindrical at the top, the Pharos looks less like a single building and more like 3 separate ambitious architects who couldn't agree on a plan and simply stacked their ideas on top of one another. A ramp spirals up the interior of the lower section, wide and gentle enough that donkeys hauled fuel up it daily, because somebody still had to feed that fire by hand, night after night, with no thermostat, no automation, and absolutely no union protections for working at those heights. At the very top burns the fire itself, its glow reportedly amplified by a great polished mirror, likely bronze, angled to throw the light far out to sea. Nobody today can fully agree on exactly how bright it truly appeared from a passing ship, and honestly, that mystery is part of the fun. What we do know is that sailors approaching the Egyptian coast, a coastline notoriously flat, hazy and easy to miscalculate, relied on that beam as their single most trustworthy landmark for navigating the last dangerous stretch into harbour. Miss it, misjudge the distance, and you could find your ship grinding onto a sandbar in the dark, which is precisely the sort of mistake this entire structure exists to prevent. Climbing partway up, as officials and privileged visitors occasionally did, you feel the wind shift dramatically, salt air turning sharper and colder the higher you go, the murmur of the docks below fading into a hush, broken only by gulls wheeling past at eye level. It is, by any ancient standard, an absurd feat of engineering. A building whose entire purpose is to burn continuously and be seen from as far away as physically possible. Ever left a porch light on for a guest arriving late, just so they can find the driveway? This is the same instinct, scaled up roughly 40,000 times and staffed around the clock by a small army of dedicated fire tenders. The structure was commissioned under the early Ptolemaic rulers and completed sometime in the early 3rd century BC, a genuine point of civic pride that appeared on coins, in poems, and eventually in the ancient world's own running list of the most impressive things human beings had ever built. Later travellers would count it among the 7 wonders, an honour it earned mostly by refusing to be ignored. Standing at its base now, craning your neck upward until your hat nearly falls off, you understand something important about this city before you've even properly entered it. Alexandria does not do subtlety. It builds the tallest thing it can manage, sets it on fire, and dares the rest of the ancient world to top that. As of this moment in history, nobody quite has. Stepping off the gangplank, you're hit immediately by a wall of noise, sweat, and unfamiliar shouting in at least 3 languages, none of which you speak fluently enough to avoid being sold something you don't want. The docks of Alexandria run on organised chaos, and you are, for the moment, simply cargo that can walk. Porters shove past balancing baskets of dates on their heads, moving with the confident indifference of men who have walked this exact stretch of stone 10,000 times and will absolutely not be slowing down for you. A merchant grabs your sleeve, insisting you need Nubian ivory, or perhaps glass beads, or perhaps whatever he happens to be holding at that particular second, his pitch adjusting in real time based on your baffled facial expression. Somewhere close by, a customs scribe sits at a small folding table, meticulously recording the contents of every crate that passes, because Ptolemaic Egypt runs an economy built on obsessive, exhaustive record-keeping, and absolutely nothing enters or leaves this harbour without being written down first. The smell down here is a genuine assault: salt water, fish guts, sweating pack animals, and the surprisingly pleasant waft of cinnamon and myrrh drifting from a nearby spice trader's stall, all competing for your attention at once. Somewhere a donkey brays in protest at its load. Somewhere else, 2 dock workers are having what sounds like a serious argument over a single amphora of wine that may or may not have cracked in transit. Nobody around you seems remotely fazed by any of it, which tells you everything about how ordinary this daily bedlam actually is. Consider the sheer logistics of what's happening around you, because this isn't merely chaos, it's chaos with a very specific job to do. Grain barges from the Nile Valley are unloading here by the ton, destined eventually to feed Rome itself once Egypt falls firmly under its influence. Incense and spices arrive from Arabian and Indian trade routes, papyrus rolls out by the bundle, and enslaved people, uncomfortably, pass through this same harbour as part of the era's grim economic reality, a detail worth remembering honestly, rather than smoothing over for the sake of a cosy travel story. The wealth on display here was real, and so was the human cost that helped generate it. Ever tried to navigate a crowded farmer's market on a Saturday morning while 5 different vendors shout over each other trying to get your attention, and somebody's dog is loose near the produce stand? Multiply that by roughly 1,000, add several unfamiliar currencies, and subtract any concept of a fixed posted price, and you have something approaching the Alexandrian dockside experience. Haggling isn't optional here. It is the entire operating system. You finally break free of the crowd near a stone archway leading up toward the city proper, breathing slightly easier as the noise thins just enough for you to hear yourself think. Behind you, the harbour keeps grinding on exactly as it has every single day for generations, and will keep doing long after your ship has sailed home without you. Welcome to Alexandria. The gangplank was the easy part. Let's get your bearings, because this city was built with a ruler, not a shrug. A single grand avenue slices straight through Alexandria, from one gate to the other, wide enough for chariots to pass 4 abreast, and colonnaded the entire way, so nobody important ever has to stand in direct sunlight. This is the Canopic Way, and walking down it feels less like wandering a city, and more like following a very confident architectural thesis statement. Unlike the winding, organic tangle of streets you might expect from an older Mediterranean city, Alexandria was laid out deliberately on a grid, commissioned personally by Alexander the Great himself before construction even began, then executed with geometric precision by his successors. Broad avenues run east to west. Narrower cross streets run north to south, and the whole arrangement gives the city a crisp, planned symmetry that even modern urban planners would nod approvingly at. Walking beneath the colonnades, you notice the shade first, a genuine relief from the relentless Egyptian sun. And then the sheer density of activity tucked beneath those covered walkways. Shopkeepers display painted pottery and bronze lamps. A public notice, freshly carved into stone, announces some new royal decree that half the passers-by stop to read and the other half openly ignore. Somewhere ahead, a procession is passing. Priests or officials moving with slow, deliberate ceremony, while ordinary pedestrians step neatly out of the way, having clearly done this particular dance before. The street itself is paved, genuinely paved, with careful stonework that keeps dust and mud to a minimum compared to dirtier cities elsewhere in the ancient world. Fresh water runs through an underground system, feeding public fountains along the route, meaning you can actually get a drink without hauling a bucket to the Nile yourself. It is, by ancient standards, an almost suspiciously well-organized experience. Ever visited a European city with wide, orderly boulevards and thought, someone clearly planned this properly? That was Alexandria's entire personality, roughly 2,000 years before city planning became a respected academic discipline instead of a rich man's hobby. The avenue runs for miles, connecting the Gate of the Sun in the east to the Gate of the Moon in the west. And along its length, you pass glimpses of the city's major districts. The Royal Quarter, shimmering closer to the harbour. The more modest residential neighbourhoods stretching inland. Each one distinct enough that a local could probably tell you which part of town you'd wandered into, just from the smell of the cooking fires alone. What strikes you most, walking this street for the first time, is the sheer confidence radiating from every carefully placed column and precisely angled intersection. This is a city that knew exactly what impression it wanted to make on new arrivals, and built an entire avenue specifically to make it. Somewhere in the modern world, a city council is currently arguing for the 11th consecutive year about whether to install a single new crosswalk. Alexandria, by contrast, simply decided it would have the best street in the known world, and then built it. No committee meetings required. It's time to find somewhere to sleep, and where you end up says everything about who you are. Alexandria sorts its residents almost as neatly as its street grid, tucking Greeks, Egyptians, and Jewish communities into their own quarters, each with its own rhythms, smells, and firmly held opinions about the other neighborhoods. The Greek quarter, unsurprisingly, sits closest to the palace and the harbour, home to the administrators, merchants, and Hellenized elite who run much of the city's official business. Houses here favour a Mediterranean style, familiar to anyone who's read a bit of Greek history. Courtyards open to the sky, painted plaster walls, and modest exteriors hiding surprisingly comfortable interiors. Because flaunting your wealth to the street was considered slightly gauche even then. Ever noticed how the nicest houses in a neighbourhood sometimes look the plainest from outside, saving all the good stuff for the backyard? Ancient Alexandrians understood this instinct perfectly. Further along sits the Egyptian quarter, called Rakotis, the original fishing settlement that predates Alexander's arrival entirely and still carries its own distinct character, closer to traditional Egyptian building styles, mud brick homes, and a rhythm of daily life tied more closely to the older customs of the Nile Valley than to imported Greek fashions. Here, the cooking smells shift too. More grain-based bread, dried fish, and onion stew simmering over small hearths. A different palate entirely from the wine and olive oil sensibilities of the Greek district nearby. The Jewish quarter, meanwhile, occupies its own substantial section of the city, home to one of the largest Jewish communities anywhere outside of Judea itself, complete with its own synagogues, its own internal governance, and eventually its own celebrated tradition of biblical scholarship and translation that would ripple outward for centuries. Walking through in the evening, you might catch the specific cadence of Hebrew or Aramaic, mixing with the Greek and Egyptian already swirling through the streets. A genuine four-language soundscape that most modern international cities would envy. Housing itself, regardless of quarter, tends toward multi-story construction, some buildings rising 3 or 4 floors, packed with apartments for the merchants, clerks, and labourers who make up the bulk of the population. Water arrives through a surprisingly sophisticated system of underground cisterns and channels, drawing from the Nile via canal, meaning even upper floors could access decent water without someone hauling jars up 4 flights of stairs constantly, a genuine luxury by ancient urban standards. What makes Alexandria's residential character so distinct is not merely the diversity itself, but how deliberately structured it is. This is not accidental clustering, it is closer to zoning, a city consciously organized to let very different cultures live in close proximity, while largely maintaining their own customs, languages, and community structures. It mostly works, most of the time, though tensions between these communities would flare into real conflict more than once across the centuries. A reminder that cosmopolitan harmony, even at its most successful, is rarely as effortless as a travel brochure might suggest. You settle finally into a modest, rented room above a shopkeeper's storefront, the murmur of 3 languages drifting up through the shutters, and think, not for the first time tonight, that this city genuinely contains multitudes. Try finding that kind of neighborhood diversity on a map today, without at least 6 overlapping food festivals. Now for the reason half the ancient world is jealous of this city. Somewhere near the palace complex sits a building stuffed with what may be several 100,000 scrolls, a collection so aggressively thorough that the phrase, "just borrowing it," was never meant to apply to anyone who sailed into port. Walking toward it, you notice the hush first, a genuine change in atmosphere from the market chaos you just escaped. Attendants move quietly between long wooden shelving units called armaria, each one crammed with tightly rolled papyrus scrolls, labelled with small tags describing their contents so scholars can locate a specific text without unrolling 40 candidates first. The scale is genuinely staggering for anyone used to a modest home collection of a few dozen books. Ancient estimates for the library's total holdings range widely, but even conservative modern scholarship agrees this was, without serious competition, the largest concentration of written knowledge anywhere in the ancient world. The collection spans everything imaginable: Greek tragedy and comedy, medical treatises, mathematical proofs, historical chronicles, epic poetry, philosophical arguments, and increasingly, texts translated from Egyptian, Hebrew, and other languages entirely, because the library's founders were determined not merely to collect Greek knowledge, but to gather and translate the accumulated wisdom of every culture they could reach. It was, in a very real sense, an attempt to build a single physical archive of everything humanity had ever bothered writing down, an ambition so enormous it borders on the delightfully unreasonable. Scholars here work at long tables, some copying texts by hand, others cross-referencing multiple versions of the same work to establish which copy contains the most reliable text, an early and genuinely rigorous form of textual scholarship. The scratch of reed pens against fresh papyrus provides a constant, quiet backdrop, punctuated occasionally by a hushed academic disagreement over whether a particular line in Homer had been transcribed correctly generations earlier. Ever been in a library where someone is passionately, quietly arguing with another patron over a footnote? This is that same energy, except the disagreement concerns a text that is already 400 years old, and both parties are being paid a government salary to keep arguing about it indefinitely. The library operated under royal patronage, meaning the Ptolemaic kings themselves funded this entire operation, viewing it as both a genuine intellectual project and a significant source of prestige, a way of declaring to the rest of the Mediterranean world that Alexandria, not Athens, was now the true capital of learning. It worked. Scholars, poets, and scientists from across the known world clamored for positions here, understanding correctly that access to this collection and the stipend that came with a post at the attached research institute represented about as good a deal as ancient intellectual life could offer. Of course, no catalogue this size survives without loss, damage, and the occasional scroll quietly going missing because someone forgot to return it. Some things apparently being universal across every century of library management. But for now, in this particular slice of the 3rd century BC, the collection stands at its glittering height, an entire civilization's curiosity given physical form and stacked neatly onto shelves, waiting for you to pick just one scroll and immediately feel embarrassingly unqualified to be here. Let's talk about the fine print of docking in this city, because Alexandria had a policy that modern airport security would frankly envy. Any ship arriving with scrolls on board could have those scrolls confiscated, copied, and replaced with the copy, while the original stayed behind for good. The policy, sometimes referred to by later writers as the ship's collection, meant that customs officials at the harbour were authorised to search incoming vessels specifically for books, and if any were found, seize them for the library's copyists to duplicate. The unlucky ship's owner would eventually get their book back, technically, except it would be a fresh copy rather than the original, an arrangement that ranged from mildly inconvenient to genuinely infuriating, depending on how attached you were to your particular scroll. Imagine boarding a flight with a signed first edition novel, only to have security politely inform you that you'll be receiving a photocopy back at baggage claim, and the original is now the property of a very prestigious institution you didn't consent to donate to. This wasn't merely petty bureaucratic overreach, though it certainly felt that way to the traders on the receiving end. It reflected something close to genuine institutional obsession. A library so committed to comprehensiveness that it was willing to bend ordinary property norms in pursuit of completeness. Ancient sources describe librarians going even further, borrowing official copies of major Greek tragedies from Athens itself, promising a substantial deposit as collateral, then simply keeping the originals and forfeiting the deposit, sending Athens a copy instead. Athens, understandably, was not thrilled. Alexandria, equally understandably, did not particularly care. Word of this policy spread throughout the Mediterranean trading world fairly quickly, and merchants adapted the way merchants always adapt to an unfavourable regulation, some declaring their scrolls up front and accepting the inevitable, others attempting to hide valuable texts among their cargo, hoping customs officials might be too busy counting amphorae of wine to notice a few rolled papyri tucked beneath the ballast. Ever tried sneaking an extra bag onto a budget airline flight, weighing your options between the overage fee and simply wearing 4 shirts at once through security. The instinct is remarkably similar, just with slightly higher intellectual stakes and considerably less spandex involved. What makes this practice so revealing is what it says about how seriously this era treated the written word as a form of genuine national treasure, worth acquiring by whatever means necessary, official channels or otherwise. The library's directors, scholars themselves, understood that a text existing somewhere else in the world did the library no good whatsoever if a copy didn't also exist on their own shelves. And they pursued that goal with the single-minded focus of a collector who has simply decided that ordinary rules of ownership are somebody else's problem. You watch, from a safe distance near the customs house, as a merchant argues heatedly with an official over a small stack of scrolls just pulled from his cargo hold, gesturing wildly, clearly aware he has already lost this particular fight. The official, for his part, looks entirely unbothered, already handing the scrolls off to a waiting scribe. This is simply how things work here. The city collects books the way some people collect grudges, thoroughly, permanently, and with absolutely no intention of ever giving the good ones back. Attached to the library sits an institution built for one purpose, paying very smart people to sit around and think, permanently. The Mouseion functioned as something between a university and an extremely well-funded think tank, and its residents never had to worry about tenure the way you might imagine. Picture a walled complex adjoining the palace grounds, complete with covered walkways, a communal dining hall, lecture rooms, and living quarters, all funded directly by the royal treasury. Scholars accepted into the Mouseion received free housing, a state salary, and communal meals, in exchange for essentially one obligation: keep thinking, keep writing, and occasionally produce something impressive enough to justify the continued royal investment. It is, without much exaggeration, the ancient equivalent of winning a lifetime academic grant with 0 teaching requirements and a built-in cafeteria, which is a deal that would make most modern professors weep with envy. Walking through the courtyard, you might overhear a genuine, heated debate between mathematicians arguing over a geometric proof, or catch 2 poets trading barbed criticism over the proper structure of an epic verse, the kind of intellectual sparring that ancient sources describe as sometimes turning genuinely bitter. Rivalries here were real, and reputations mattered enormously, since a scholar's entire livelihood depended on maintaining the king's confidence that funding their particular obsession was money well spent. Ever sat in a meeting where 2 colleagues passive-aggressively one-up each other over whose project deserves more budget? This was that exact same energy, except the budget in question came directly from a pharaoh, and the stakes included your continued access to free bread. The subjects pursued here span an almost dizzying range. Mathematicians work through geometric proofs that would remain foundational for the next 2,000 years. Physicians study anatomy with a rigor rarely matched elsewhere in the ancient world. Poets compile and edit the great works of earlier Greek literature, establishing which versions of Homer's epics should be considered authoritative, a task that involved genuine textual detective work, comparing dozens of variant manuscripts line by line. Astronomers track the movements of stars and planets with an obsessive precision that would later inform navigation and calendars across multiple civilizations. What ties all of this together is the institution's underlying philosophy, the radical idea that knowledge itself deserved dedicated, funded, protected pursuit, separate from any immediate practical application. A scholar studying the anatomy of the eye wasn't necessarily trying to cure a specific patient. A mathematician working through conic sections wasn't necessarily solving an engineering problem. The pursuit itself was considered worthwhile, a genuinely progressive notion for its time, even if it occasionally produced findings with no obvious use for another several centuries. Of course, royal patronage came with its own quiet pressures. Scholars depended entirely on the continued goodwill of the ruling dynasty, meaning political shifts, succession disputes, or simple royal boredom could threaten a comfortable position overnight. It was a gilded cage in the most literal sense, extraordinary freedom to think, bounded entirely by the whims of whoever currently sat on the throne. You linger near the courtyard a while longer, watching two elderly scholars debate something involving triangles with the passionate intensity most people reserve for arguing about sports, and think, not unreasonably, that you have just witnessed the ancient world's most exclusive, most argumentative, and most thoroughly fed academic conference, one that never technically ends. Let's talk about the material all this genius gets written on, because papyrus does not simply appear out of the ground ready to hold your grocery list. It takes a riverbank reed, a great deal of slicing, pressing, and patience, and an entire industry built around keeping the whole intellectual enterprise supplied with something to write on. The process begins along the Nile itself, where papyrus reeds grow thick in the marshy shallows, harvested by workers who wade in, cut the tall stalks near the base, and haul them back by the bundle. The outer rind gets stripped away, revealing the soft, fibrous pith inside, which is then sliced into thin strips, laid out in overlapping horizontal and vertical layers, and pressed firmly together under weight. The plant's own natural sap acts as an adhesive, binding the layers into a single sheet as it dries, a genuinely elegant bit of low-tech chemistry that requires no glue, no special ingredients, just the plant cooperating with itself under enough pressure. Once dried, the surface gets polished smooth, often with a stone or a shell, buffing away any roughness until the sheet takes ink cleanly without bleeding or catching on stray fibres. Individual sheets are then joined edge to edge into long rolls, some stretching to considerable lengths, then wound around a wooden rod for storage and reading. Unrolling one of these scrolls, you notice the faint golden colour of good papyrus, the cross-hatched texture visible if you hold it to the light, and a distinct, dry, grassy smell that clings faintly to your fingers afterward. Producing papyrus at the volume this city demands is genuinely serious industrial output. Alexandria doesn't merely supply its own library and scholars, it exports papyrus throughout the Mediterranean world, effectively holding a near monopoly on the material, since the specific reed grows so abundantly along the Nile and comparatively poorly almost anywhere else. This gives Egypt, and by extension Alexandria, enormous economic leverage, a bit like controlling the world's entire supply of a single essential product and charging accordingly. Ever tried to buy a specific replacement part for an appliance, only to discover one single manufacturer controls the entire supply chain and can charge whatever they please? Ancient papyrus buyers understood that particular frustration intimately, though at least nobody was demanding a subscription renewal. Cost varies depending on quality, with the finest, whitest sheets reserved for royal correspondence and prestigious literary works, while rougher, cheaper grades handle everyday business records, tax receipts, and the sort of mundane bureaucratic paperwork that apparently exists in every era of human civilization without exception. A scholar copying an important manuscript reaches for the good stuff. A merchant jotting down a shipping manifest uses whatever's cheapest and doesn't much care if the edges are a bit ragged. Papyrus does have its limits, though, cracking and becoming brittle if stored improperly, vulnerable to damp, mould, and the occasional hungry insect, which is precisely why the library's copyists stay perpetually busy transcribing older, deteriorating scrolls onto fresh material before the originals crumble entirely. It is, in its own quiet way, a race against time that never actually finishes, every generation of scholars inheriting the same slow, ongoing task of keeping older knowledge legible for whoever comes next. You tuck a small scrap of papyrus into your bag as a souvenir, already imagining how unimpressed everyone back home will be by a plain beige sheet of dried reed. They have no idea what an entire civilization's worth of infrastructure went into producing it. Should you have arrived as a young scholar rather than a bewildered traveller, your days would look rather different, structured around lectures, debates, and the constant low hum of people trying to sound smarter than the person next to them. Formal education in Alexandria typically begins for boys, and occasionally girls from wealthier families, around the age of 6 or 7, starting with basic literacy and numeracy taught by a private tutor or in a small schoolroom setting. Wax tablets serve as the practice surface of choice for young students, since mistakes can simply be smoothed over and rewritten, rather than wasting precious papyrus on a child's first clumsy attempts at the Greek alphabet. Discipline tends to run strict by modern standards, a wandering attention span more likely to earn a sharp word or a light rap on the knuckles than a gentle redirection, an approach that would raise considerable eyebrows at a modern parent-teacher conference. As students progress, the curriculum shifts toward grammar, rhetoric, and a close study of major literary works, particularly Homer, whose epics function as something close to a foundational cultural text, memorized, recited, and analyzed with the same seriousness a modern student might apply to a required national exam. Mathematics enters the picture too, along with basic astronomy for those aiming toward more advanced study, and increasingly, given the city's particular character, exposure to multiple languages, since a genuinely successful Alexandrian merchant or scholar benefits enormously from fluency beyond Greek alone. For the most promising students, particularly young men from families with the right connections or the right reputation, the path can lead eventually toward the Mouseion itself, or, at minimum, toward attending public lectures given by its resident scholars, sessions open to a wider audience eager to absorb whatever wisdom happens to be on offer that particular afternoon. Picture rows of listeners seated on stone benches in a shaded courtyard, murmuring appreciatively or skeptically, depending on how convincing the speaker's argument happens to be, occasionally interrupting with a pointed question designed more to showcase the questioner's own cleverness than genuinely seek clarification. Ever sat through a work presentation where someone asks a needlessly complicated question purely to remind the room how much they know? This dynamic is not remotely a modern invention. Female education, it must be said honestly, remains considerably more limited and largely confined to wealthier households, focused typically on literacy, music, and household management, rather than the more expansive scholarly curriculum available to boys. Though exceptions certainly existed, particularly among prominent families where daughters received genuine intellectual training alongside their brothers. It would be inaccurate to pretend this era offered anything close to equal educational opportunity, and dishonest to smooth over that inequality for the sake of a tidier story. Tuition, where formal schooling exists outside wealthy private tutoring, typically falls to individual families to arrange and pay for directly, meaning access to quality education correlates rather predictably with financial means, a pattern that, uncomfortably, has proven remarkably persistent across roughly every century of human history since. Still, for a young person fortunate enough to access it, Alexandria in this era represents genuinely one of the best possible places in the known world to receive an education, surrounded by more accumulated knowledge, more visiting experts, and more intellectual ferment than almost anywhere else a person could hope to study. You watch a cluster of students hurry past, tablets under their arms, already arguing about something from that morning's lecture, and think that some things, evidently, never change. Students have been complaining about homework since roughly the invention of homework itself. Let's talk about the doctors of this city, because Alexandria's medical scholars did something almost nobody else in the ancient world was willing to do, which was cut open a human body to actually see what was happening inside it. Physicians here, most notably figures whose work would influence medical understanding for centuries afterward, pursued a level of anatomical study that stood in genuine contrast to the more theoretical or superstition-tinged medicine practiced elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean. Working, according to ancient accounts, with human cadavers, and by some more controversial ancient reports, even condemned prisoners while still living, these physicians mapped the nervous system, distinguished arteries from veins, and studied the workings of the brain with a directness that simply wasn't attempted in most other cultures of the period, where cutting open a corpse, carried heavy religious or cultural taboo. This willingness stemmed partly from Egypt's own long tradition of embalming and mummification, a practice that already required a certain practical familiarity with the human body's internal structure, blended now with Greek scientific curiosity and philosophical rigor. The result was genuinely groundbreaking work, identifying the brain, rather than the heart, as the seat of the nervous system and intelligence, along with detailed studies of the eye, the reproductive organs, and the digestive tract, findings that would remain influential in medical thinking for well over 1,000 years afterward. Picture a physician's consulting room, simple by modern standards, but well-equipped for its era, shelves lined with small ceramic jars of dried herbs, mineral compounds, and prepared remedies, alongside a set of bronze surgical instruments, scalpels, hooks, and probes laid out with careful precision. A patient describes their symptoms, while the physician, drawing on both careful physical examination and an accumulated body of written case studies, works through possible diagnoses with a method that, while lacking modern tools, follows a genuinely systematic logic recognizable as the ancestor of clinical reasoning. Ever sat in a doctor's office while they cross-reference your symptoms against a database of similar cases? The instinct is identical. Just replace the database with a scroll, and the doctor's confidence with slightly more incense burning in the corner. Not everything here holds up under modern scrutiny, of course. Treatments still incorporate plenty of humoral theory, the belief that health depends on balancing 4 bodily fluids, along with remedies that lean as much on ritual and prayer as on anything resembling pharmacology. A headache might be treated with a genuinely useful herbal compress, alongside a small invocation to a relevant deity for good measure, because covering every possible angle seemed only sensible when the stakes were this high, and the understanding of disease still fundamentally incomplete. What makes Alexandria's medical scholarship genuinely remarkable, though, is the institutional support behind it. Physicians working within the Mouseion structure, comparing findings, building on one another's observations, and creating something approaching a genuine scientific community, rather than isolated practitioners working in total ignorance of each other's discoveries. It represents an early, imperfect, but real step toward medicine as a collaborative, evidence-gathering discipline, rather than pure inherited tradition. You leave the physician's quarter feeling a strange mixture of reassurance and unease, admiring the genuine rigor on display, while being quietly grateful that your own headache tonight will be treated with modern painkillers, rather than a carefully measured invocation and a bronze probe. Progress, it turns out, is a slow and occasionally alarming process. It's time to look up, because this city produced some of the most quietly astonishing science of the ancient world, using nothing more sophisticated than shadows, geometry, and a stubborn refusal to accept "we'll never know" as an answer. Perhaps the most famous example involves a scholar working here who calculated the circumference of the entire Earth using nothing more than the length of a shadow, a well's reflection, and some careful measurement between 2 Egyptian cities. By comparing the angle of sunlight at noon on the same day in 2 different locations, a known distance apart, he worked out the Earth's curvature and arrived at a circumference estimate remarkably close to modern measurements, an achievement so elegant in its simplicity that it still shows up in classrooms today as one of history's great scientific triumphs. Ever tried estimating something complicated using only the tools you happen to have lying around the house? This is that instinct, executed at the highest possible level, using a stick, a shadow, and pure mathematical confidence. Alongside this, astronomers here track the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets with meticulous, ongoing observation, building star catalogues and refining calendar calculations that later civilizations, including eventually medieval Europe and the Islamic world, would rely on extensively. Working without telescopes, without any instrument more advanced than careful sighting devices and geometric calculation, these scholars nonetheless produce astonishingly accurate models of celestial movement, understanding eclipses, predicting planetary positions, and mapping the visible sky with a precision that would remain essentially unmatched for well over a millennium. Mathematics flourishes here too, quite apart from astronomy, with geometric proofs and theorems worked out that remain foundational to the subject even now, studied by school children roughly 2,000 years later without much modification. Picture a scholar seated in a quiet courtyard, a wax tablet balanced on his knee, sketching geometric diagrams with a stylus while muttering through a proof under his breath, checking and rechecking each logical step before committing it to more permanent papyrus. This is not glamorous work by any measure, mostly quiet, repetitive, and occasionally frustrating, punctuated by the rare, genuine thrill of a proof finally clicking into place after days of dead ends. What's genuinely striking about this entire scientific culture is the collaborative record-keeping underlying it. Findings get written down, copied, shared among scholars, and built upon by the next generation, rather than lost or reinvented from scratch each time, precisely because the library and the Mouseion, together, create the infrastructure necessary for genuine cumulative knowledge, something that requires far more institutional support than a single brilliant individual working in isolation could ever manage alone. None of this happens without genuine error and disagreement either. Scholars here debate rival astronomical models, argue over whether the Earth or the Sun sits at the centre of everything, and occasionally reach conclusions that later evidence would overturn entirely. Science, even at its most rigorous, has always involved a fair amount of confident wrongness alongside its genuine breakthroughs, and this era proves no exception. Standing beneath the clear Egyptian night sky, stars scattered with a brightness no modern city light pollution would ever permit you to see again, you understand a little of what drew these scholars to look up so carefully in the first place. The sky here genuinely looks like something worth measuring. Let's talk about lunch, because a city this cosmopolitan does not serve one single cuisine, it serves all of them at once, shouted at you simultaneously from adjacent stalls until you simply point at whatever smells the least dangerous. The central marketplace hums with a chaotic, layered soundscape, vendors calling out prices in Greek and Egyptian, the sizzle of fish frying in oil, the rhythmic thud of bread dough being worked on a wooden board nearby. Egyptian staples dominate the everyday diet for most residents. Flatbread made from emmer wheat, lentils simmered with onion and cumin, and the Nile's abundant fish, grilled, salted, or dried for longer storage, since refrigeration remains, unsurprisingly, a few thousand years away from invention. Wander further, and you'll find Greek influences layered thickly on top. Olive oil drizzled generously over vegetables, wine sold by the jug from stalls stacked high with amphorae, and cheese pressed from goat's milk sold in small, pungent wedges. Dates and figs pile in sticky, fragrant heaps, sold by weight to customers who squeeze and sniff each one first, with the exact same critical scrutiny a modern shopper applies to produce at a farmer's market, deeply suspicious that the vendor is trying to pass off the slightly overripe ones. Spices arrive here from genuinely remarkable distances. Cinnamon and pepper carried along trade routes stretching toward Arabia and India, sold in small, measured quantities because their price reflects the sheer distance and difficulty involved in getting them here at all. A pinch of good pepper might cost you more than an entire basket of bread, a reminder that the phrase, "worth its weight in gold," wasn't always pure exaggeration in the ancient spice trade. Ever paid an absurd amount for a specific imported ingredient at a specialty grocery store just to make one recipe taste exactly right? Alexandrian cooks understood that particular financial regret intimately. Street food exists here in genuine abundance, too. Small fried fish sold wrapped in leaves, honeyed pastries drizzled generously enough to attract every wasp within 100 paces, and roasted chickpeas sold hot from a brazier, a perfectly portable snack for a busy resident weaving through the market with no particular time to sit for a proper meal. You purchase a small handful, burning your fingers slightly in the process, and think that some universal truths about street food, namely that it will always somehow be too hot to hold comfortably, apparently transcend both geography and millennia. Wealthier households, meanwhile, host considerably more elaborate meals. Multiple courses featuring roasted meats, imported delicacies, and wine specifically chosen to complement each course. A level of culinary theatre reserved for those with both the means and the leisure time to care about such distinctions. The gap between a dock worker's evening meal of bread and lentils and a wealthy merchant's multi-course dinner party is enormous. A reminder that this glittering, cosmopolitan city, for all its intellectual achievement, remains sharply divided by wealth, much like every ancient metropolis of comparable size and ambition. Still, walking through the market at midday, stomach growling, surrounded by more distinct aromas and languages than you could reasonably process at once, you feel something close to genuine delight. This is a city that takes eating seriously, whatever your budget happens to allow, and that instinct, at least, feels entirely familiar, no matter how many centuries separate you from the vendor currently trying to convince you that, yes, this particular jar of honey is absolutely worth the price he's asking. Come evening, if you're lucky enough to be invited, you'll find yourself at a symposium, a dinner party built almost entirely around wine, conversation, and the deeply specific etiquette of lying on one elbow while pretending this is comfortable. Guests arrive at a private home and are led to a dining room arranged with low couches positioned around the room's perimeter, each meant to seat 1 or 2 reclining guests, propped up on cushions with their feet extended away from a central low table. This is simply how formal dining works in Greek-influenced Alexandrian society, and mastering the pose takes genuine practice, your left elbow doing considerably more structural work than you'd expect, holding up your entire upper body for the length of an evening that can easily stretch past midnight. Ever tried eating an entire meal lying on your side, balanced on one arm, while also trying to maintain witty conversation? It is considerably harder than it looks, and you will absolutely feel it in your shoulder the next morning. Wine forms the actual centerpiece of the evening, diluted with water according to careful, debated ratios, since drinking wine undiluted is considered a mark of poor breeding or outright barbarism, depending on who you ask. A designated symposiarch, essentially the evening's master of ceremonies, determines exactly how strong that evening's wine mixture will be and how many rounds the group will get through. A role taken with surprising seriousness, given that the entire tenor of the evening's conversation depends heavily on his judgment. Get the ratio wrong, pour it too strong too early, and you risk an evening sliding rapidly from thoughtful philosophical debate into considerably less thoughtful shouting. The conversation itself ranges widely, and often quite seriously. Philosophy, poetry, politics, and the latest gossip from the Mouseion, all mixing together, depending on the crowd assembled that particular evening. Entertainment might include a hired musician playing a lyre, a dancer, or simply increasingly elaborate rounds of a drinking game involving flicking the dregs of your wine cup at a target across the room, a pastime that sounds considerably less dignified than the philosophical debates happening simultaneously 2 couches over. And somehow, both activities occur at the very same gathering without anyone finding this remotely contradictory. Food accompanies the wine steadily throughout the evening, rather than arriving as a single formal meal. Small dishes of olives, cheese, roasted meats, and honeyed sweets circulating continuously. Guests picking at whatever catches their interest between rounds of conversation and wine. Servants move quietly between the couches, refilling cups and clearing empty dishes, their constant, practiced presence a reminder that this entire relaxed intellectual evening depends on considerable invisible labour happening just outside your direct attention. Women, it should be said plainly, are largely excluded from formal symposium attendance as guests in most respectable households, though hired entertainers and, in some documented cases, educated courtesans capable of holding their own in philosophical debate do sometimes attend, occupying an uncomfortable social position that granted them intellectual participation denied to respectable wives, while offering considerably less social protection in return. By the time you finally leave, your elbow thoroughly numb and your understanding of proper wine dilution ratios unexpectedly expanded, you appreciate the genuine skill involved in an evening that looks, from the outside, like simple, indulgent leisure, but actually requires careful choreography, social awareness, and a surprisingly firm grip on complicated etiquette, all while balanced precariously on one arm.
Let's discuss what you're wearing, because Alexandria's streets host Greek tunics, Egyptian linen, and everything in between, and your outfit will very quietly announce which crowd you belong to before you've said a single word. For most residents, regardless of background, the basic garment remains a simple tunic, typically linen, given Egypt's abundant flax production and the brutal, unrelenting local heat. Wool being reserved mostly for cooler evenings or winter months when temperatures actually drop enough to justify it. Men typically wear a chiton, a straightforward rectangular garment pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist, its length and quality varying considerably depending on your social standing and how much fabric you can reasonably afford to drape across your frame without looking either underdressed or absurdly ostentatious. Women's clothing follows broadly similar principles. A longer tunic, often paired with a himation, a larger wrapped outer garment that could be draped in various styles, depending on occasion and personal preference, offering both modesty and, frankly, a fairly impressive amount of individual fashion expression within what looks, at first glance, like a fairly restrictive set of options. Wealthy women accessorize considerably further. Jewelry featuring gold, semi-precious stones, and intricate metalwork, along with elaborately styled hair often held in place with pins and small decorative combs. The entire ensemble a fairly clear, unsubtle signal of exactly how much disposable wealth the household commands. Egyptian residents, meanwhile, particularly in the Rakotis quarter, often maintain more traditional Egyptian dress, simpler draped linen garments reflecting older customs that predate the Greek influence considerably, along with distinctive Egyptian styling around eye makeup and jewelry. Kohl applied thickly around the eyes for both aesthetic and genuinely practical sun glare reduction purposes, a surprisingly sensible bit of ancient function hiding inside what looks like pure decoration.
Ever squinted uncomfortably on a bright day and wished you'd thought to bring sunglasses? Egyptian eye makeup was solving that exact problem several thousand years before anyone invented tinted lenses. Colour and fabric quality serve as the city's most immediate, unmissable class marker. Undyed or simply dyed linen marks an ordinary working resident, while the wealthy display richer colours, purples and deep reds achieved through genuinely expensive dyeing processes, along with finer weaves and imported fabrics that instantly separate them from the crowd at a single glance. Ever noticed how a well-tailored coat versus an obviously cheap one communicates something about a person before they've said a single word? Alexandrian society ran on that exact same instinct, just executed through fabric weight and dye quality rather than a designer label stitched somewhere discreet. Footwear tends toward simple sandals for most residents, practical given the climate, though wealthier citizens might sport finer leatherwork or, for particularly formal occasions, considerably more elaborate designs. Many residents, especially indoors or among the poorer classes, simply go barefoot, a detail that would horrify a modern pedestrian accustomed to properly paved, debris-free sidewalks, but barely registers as noteworthy here. What strikes you most, walking these crowded streets and cataloguing the sheer variety on display, is how clearly clothing here functions as a constant, wordless form of communication, announcing wealth, cultural background, occupation, and social standing before a single word gets exchanged. You glance down at your own travel-worn tunic, dusty from the docks and clearly marking you as some sort of confused visitor, and suspect that every merchant who's approached you today already knew exactly how much haggling room they had before you'd even opened your mouth. Let's talk about who Alexandria actually worships, because the city's rulers essentially invented a god from scratch, blending Greek and Egyptian deities into a single, deliberately marketable package designed to keep everybody happy at once. The god in question, Serapis, was introduced deliberately under the early Ptolemaic dynasty, combining aspects of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with the visual style and character of Greek deities like Zeus and Hades, resulting in a bearded, distinctly Greek-looking figure who nonetheless carried genuine Egyptian religious authority underneath the surface. It was, essentially, a calculated act of religious branding, an attempt to give both the native Egyptian population and the ruling Greek elite a shared deity they could each recognize something of themselves in, smoothing over what might otherwise have been a genuinely awkward cultural divide. Ever seen a company rebrand a product specifically to appeal to two very different customer bases at once, keeping the packaging different depending on which market it's sold in? This is the ancient religious equivalent, executed with considerably higher stakes than a cereal box redesign. Beyond this deliberately constructed cult, the older Egyptian gods remain very much alive and actively worshipped throughout the city, particularly in the Rakotis quarter, where temples to Isis, Osiris, and a whole pantheon of traditional deities continue functioning much as they always have, largely unbothered by the newer Greek-flavoured theological experiment happening closer to the palace. Isis, in particular, enjoys enormous popularity, her worship eventually spreading well beyond Egypt entirely, carried by traders and travellers throughout the wider Mediterranean world, making her one of antiquity's genuine theological exports. Greek gods, meanwhile, maintain their own temples and dedicated worship throughout the city's Greek quarter. Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, and the rest of the familiar Olympian pantheon receiving offerings, festivals, and dedicated priesthoods much as they would in Athens or any other major Greek city. Walking through the city on any given day, you might pass a modest shrine tucked into a residential courtyard, incense curling upward from a small offering, right around the corner from a grand, formal temple hosting an elaborate public ceremony. The sacred and the everyday sitting comfortably side by side without much apparent friction. Religious festivals punctuate the calendar regularly, processions winding through the streets carrying sacred images, accompanied by music, dancing, and considerable public celebration that briefly transforms the entire city's rhythm for a day or two at a time. Ordinary residents participate enthusiastically, regardless of their particular cultural background, since religious festival, much like a modern public holiday, tends to attract enthusiastic crowds, regardless of whether everyone present shares identical theological convictions. Some people, after all, just want the day off and the free public spectacle. Beneath this generally tolerant, blended religious landscape, genuine tension does simmer occasionally, particularly as different communities compete for royal favour, temple funding, and social standing. Disputes that would, in later centuries, flare into serious and sometimes violent conflict between Alexandria's different religious and ethnic communities. For now, in this particular moment, the city manages a fairly remarkable balancing act, multiple belief systems coexisting, borrowing from each other, and largely tolerating one another's public rituals with a degree of pragmatic acceptance that many later, less cosmopolitan cities would struggle to match. You pause near a small roadside shrine, watching a woman leave a modest offering of bread and a murmured prayer, and think that whatever else this city gets right or wrong, it has at least figured out how to let several very different gods share the same sidewalk without anybody, so far, coming to blows over the arrangement. Rising on the western edge of the city sits the great temple built for exactly that god, a structure so grand it earned a reputation as one of the most magnificent buildings in the ancient world, second in local pride only to the library itself. Approaching the Serapeum, you climb a long, deliberately imposing staircase leading up toward a raised platform, the temple complex itself surrounded by colonnaded courtyards designed to make visitors feel appropriately small and reverent, well before they've even reached the main sanctuary. The main building houses a massive cult statue of Serapis, seated, bearded, crowned with a distinctive grain basket symbolizing abundance and fertility, carved with the kind of careful craftsmanship meant to convey both Greek artistic sensibility and genuine divine authority in a single glance. Inside, the air hangs thick with incense, frankincense and myrrh, burning continuously on nearby altars, their smoke curling upward through shafts of light filtering down from high windows, creating an atmosphere deliberately engineered to feel otherworldly, regardless of which particular deity you personally worship back home. Priests move through the space with practiced, ceremonial precision, tending sacred flames, accepting offerings, and occasionally delivering oracles or interpretations to visitors seeking guidance on everything from business decisions to matters of the heart. A genuine ancient consulting service, charging in devotion rather than currency, though a generous accompanying donation certainly never hurt your chances of a favourable reading. The temple complex includes an attached library of its own, a smaller sister collection to the Great Library proper, along with lecture halls where philosophical and religious teaching regularly takes place, meaning the boundary between pure religious devotion and genuine intellectual pursuit stays remarkably blurry here. The sacred and the scholarly sharing the very same physical space without much apparent contradiction. Ever visited a grand cathedral that also happens to house a genuinely impressive museum collection? The sacred and the cultural coexisting comfortably under one roof. The Serapeum operates on that exact same principle, several centuries earlier. Public festivals dedicated to Serapis draw enormous crowds throughout the year, processions carrying his image through the streets, accompanied by music, dancing, and considerable public celebration. The whole affair functioning as both genuine religious devotion and a significant unifying civic event, bringing together residents from every quarter of the city, regardless of their individual background. For a single day at least, Greek and Egyptian, wealthy and poor, all find themselves shoulder to shoulder in the same crowd, cheering the same procession past. The building itself represents a genuinely enormous architectural undertaking, built from imported stone, decorated with statuary and artwork, commissioned specifically to showcase the wealth and ambition of the Ptolemaic dynasty that funded its construction. It is, in the most literal sense, a monument to deliberate religious engineering. A temple built not from centuries of organic, evolving tradition, but from calculated political and cultural strategy, executed so successfully that within a generation or two, most residents worship there with entirely genuine devotion, the artificial origins of their god largely forgotten, or simply no longer relevant to how they actually feel walking up those imposing stairs. Standing at the temple's threshold, incense stinging your eyes slightly, you find yourself genuinely moved, despite knowing full well the calculated political reasoning behind this god's very existence. Apparently manufactured devotion, given enough time, enough incense, and enough magnificent architecture, becomes simply indistinguishable from the real thing. Let's talk about the sacred animals, because Egyptian religious tradition takes this concept far more literally than you might expect, with entire temples devoted to specific cats, ibises, and crocodiles, treated with a reverence that would confuse your average modern house pet. Walking through certain temple precincts, particularly those maintaining older Egyptian traditions, you encounter dedicated animal sanctuaries housing creatures considered sacred embodiments of specific deities. Cats associated with the goddess Bastet, ibises linked to Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, and crocodiles honoured in connection with Sobek. These animals live within temple grounds, fed and cared for by dedicated priests, their well-being considered a matter of genuine religious significance rather than simple animal husbandry. Harming one, even accidentally, carries serious social and sometimes legal consequences, a level of protected status that would make a modern animal rights activist genuinely impressed, if slightly bewildered by the theological reasoning underneath it. The scale of this practice becomes genuinely startling once you learn about the mummification involved. Millions of animal mummies, cats, ibises, and other sacred creatures are prepared and buried in dedicated necropolises throughout Egypt. Pilgrims purchasing a mummified animal offering much the way a modern visitor might purchase a votive candle at a cathedral, a physical token of devotion left as an offering to the relevant deity. Entire industries exist purely to breed, raise, and mummify these animals in the quantities that religious demand requires. A genuinely fascinating intersection of faith and commerce operating at an industrial scale that would surprise anyone expecting animal worship to be a quiet, small-scale affair. Ever watched someone treat their house cat with a level of devotion bordering on genuine religious reverence, elaborate feeding schedules, dedicated furniture, a wardrobe more extensive than most humans? Ancient Egyptian cat veneration operated on that same instinct, just formalized into actual state-sponsored religious infrastructure, with considerably higher stakes for anyone caught mistreating the animal in question. Herodotus, writing decades earlier, describes Egyptians shaving their eyebrows in mourning when a household cat died naturally, a level of grief response that modern pet owners would find entirely relatable.
even if the specific morning ritual has fallen somewhat out of fashion. The ibis holds particular significance, given its association with Thoth, the god credited with inventing writing itself, meaning in a city this obsessed with scholarship and the written word, the ibis carries a genuinely fitting symbolic weight, a sacred bird watching over a metropolis that has essentially built its entire civic identity around books and learning. Crocodiles, meanwhile, inspire a rather more complicated mixture of reverence and terror, worshipped in certain regions as manifestations of Sobek's power, while also being, quite reasonably, genuinely feared by anyone living near the Nile's crocodile-infested waters, a combination of devotion and self-preservation instinct that seems entirely sensible given the animal in question. This entire practice reflects something deeper about how thoroughly ancient Egyptian religious tradition integrates the natural world into its theology. Animals not merely symbolizing divine qualities from a comfortable metaphorical distance, but actually housing, embodying, and channeling genuine sacred presence in a way that Greek religious tradition, with its more anthropomorphic gods, never quite matched. You watch a priest carefully feed a temple cat from a small ceramic dish, the animal accepting the offering with the supreme, unbothered confidence of a creature who has always understood, correctly, exactly how important it is. Some things, evidently, remain true across every single era of human civilization without exception. It's time to talk about what everyone's actually saying around you, because Alexandria runs on a dizzying mix of Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew, and the city's scholars took on the genuinely massive project of translating sacred texts between them. Greek functions as the city's dominant administrative and intellectual language, the tongue of government, commerce among the elite, and virtually all scholarly work produced at the Mouseion and library. Egyptian, in its demotic written form and various spoken dialects, remains the everyday language of the majority native population, particularly outside the Greek Quarter, meaning a genuinely functional resident of this city needs at least passing familiarity with both, along with enough patience to navigate the inevitable moments where neither language quite bridges a particular conversation. Hebrew and Aramaic round out the picture considerably, spoken throughout the substantial Jewish community, which maintains its own distinct linguistic and religious traditions, while still participating actively in the city's broader commercial and intellectual life. The single most significant linguistic undertaking happening in this era, without much serious competition, involves the translation of Hebrew scripture into Greek, a project traditionally associated with 70 or 72 scholars working, according to later legend, independently, yet somehow producing identical translations, a story that has stretched considerably in the retelling over subsequent centuries, but reflects something genuinely real underneath the embellishment. This translation, eventually known as the Septuagint, would go on to become enormously significant for Jewish communities living outside Judea, who no longer read Hebrew fluently, and later for early Christian communities who would rely on this Greek translation extensively. Picture the actual working process behind this. Scholars seated in adjoining rooms or perhaps a shared hall, working methodically through the text passage by passage, debating word choices,
wrestling with concepts that don't translate cleanly between languages built on entirely different cultural and religious assumptions. Ever tried explaining a joke or a deeply specific cultural reference to someone from a completely different background, watching the humor or meaning simply evaporate somewhere in the translation? These scholars faced that exact challenge, except the stakes involved sacred religious text rather than a joke about your uncle, and getting it wrong carried considerably more weight than an awkward silence at dinner. Beyond this single famous project, translation work happens constantly throughout the city on a smaller scale. Merchants employing interpreters to navigate trade negotiations, scholars translating Egyptian religious and medical texts into Greek to expand the library's collection, and ordinary residents developing genuine, practical multilingual fluency simply through the daily necessity of living in a city this thoroughly mixed. Children in mixed households often grow up genuinely bilingual or trilingual without much formal instruction at all, simply absorbing whatever languages surround them at home, in the market, and among their friends, a kind of organic linguistic education considerably more effective than any formal classroom could manage. This constant linguistic layering gives the city's streets a genuinely distinctive soundscape, conversations shifting fluidly between languages mid-sentence, vendors adjusting their pitch depending on which language a potential customer seems most comfortable with, official proclamations posted in multiple languages simultaneously to ensure the broadest possible audience actually understands what's being announced. Standing in the market, half following 3 separate overlapping conversations in 3 different languages, you feel a small flicker of genuine admiration for a city that manages this level of daily linguistic juggling without, apparently, anyone finding it particularly remarkable. It's simply Tuesday here. Everywhere else in the ancient world, it would be considered a minor miracle. Let's talk about staying clean, because the Mediterranean sun does not negotiate, and the public bathhouses of Alexandria become less a luxury and more a daily survival requirement the moment you step outside at midday. Public bathhouses dot the city at regular intervals, functioning as genuine community gathering spaces as much as practical hygiene facilities. Residents visiting not merely to wash, but to socialize, catch up on neighborhood gossip, and escape the brutal midday heat for an hour or 2 of relative comfort. Water arrives via the city's impressively engineered system of underground cisterns and channels, drawing from the Nile through a network that keeps even non-riverside neighborhoods reliably supplied, a genuine feat of urban infrastructure that many considerably later cities would struggle to match. Inside, you'll typically find separate rooms progressing from cooler to warmer temperatures, bathers moving through a sequence not unlike a modern spa circuit, a practical routine designed around the body's own comfort rather than pure ritual for its own sake. Attendants offer scented oils, since soap in the modern sense doesn't yet exist here. Bathers instead applying oil to the skin, then scraping it off along with accumulated dirt and sweat, using a curved bronze tool called a strigil. A technique that sounds faintly medieval to modern ears, but proves genuinely effective at removing grime without any actual soap involved. ever left a gym or spa feeling genuinely refreshed, less because of the actual exercise or treatment, and more because of the sheer, simple pleasure of clean skin and quiet conversation with people you happen to know? Alexandrian bathhouses provide that exact same social and physical relief, just with considerably more scraping involved and a noticeably higher concentration of philosophical debate happening in the background. Since, apparently, no Alexandrian institution can go more than an hour without someone starting an argument about geometry. Hair care receives serious attention too, particularly among wealthier residents. Oils and perfumes applied liberally, elaborate styling for women involving pins, ribbons, and occasionally wigs for especially formal occasions, since Egypt's climate makes elaborate natural hairstyles genuinely impractical to maintain daily in the heat. Men, meanwhile, favour closely trimmed beards or, among the more fashion-conscious Greek elite, being clean-shaven entirely, a look popularised partly through Alexander's own famous preference and subsequently copied enthusiastically by those hoping to project a similarly polished, modern image. Teeth cleaning involves chewed sticks or cloth rubbed with abrasive powders, a considerably less pleasant experience than modern dental care, but a genuine attempt at basic oral hygiene nonetheless, one that ancient medical texts discuss with surprising specificity regarding which powders and techniques actually prove most effective. Perfumes and scented oils serve double duty throughout the city too, masking the inevitable, unavoidable smells of a dense urban population living without modern sanitation, while also functioning as a genuine status marker. Expensive imported scents signalling wealth just as clearly as fine fabric or elaborate jewellery. Public latrines exist throughout the city as well, though sanitation by modern standards remains genuinely rudimentary, waste management relying heavily on manual labour, and a drainage system that, while impressively engineered for its era, still leaves considerably more to be desired than anything you'd consider acceptable back home. You navigate around a particularly aromatic side street with the practiced quickness of someone who has already learned, through direct, unfortunate experience, exactly which routes through this city to avoid at certain times of day. Leaving the bathhouse finally, skin scraped clean, hair freshly oiled, you feel genuinely refreshed despite the complete absence of anything resembling modern soap, and privately admit that whatever this city lacks in plumbing sophistication, it more than makes up for in sheer, unhurried commitment to the ritual of getting properly, thoroughly clean. Tucked along the harbour sits an entire walled district belonging to the ruling dynasty. A palace complex so extensive it functions as a small city within the city, complete with its own gardens, guards, and rules about who is allowed to look at whom. Approaching the palace walls, you notice the guards first, stationed at regular intervals, armed and visibly alert, in a way that the rest of the city's more relaxed daily rhythm simply doesn't require. This entire quarter, sometimes referred to collectively as the Brucheion, houses not merely the royal residence itself, but an entire sprawling complex, administrative buildings, gardens, private harbours reserved exclusively for royal and diplomatic vessels, and quite possibly a version of the great library's most treasured holdings, kept close at hand for the ruling family's personal convenience. Peering through an open gate, glimpsed briefly before a guard politely but firmly redirects your attention elsewhere, you catch sight of formal gardens, laid out with the same geometric precision as the city's main avenue, imported plants and carefully maintained fountains, creating an atmosphere of controlled, curated luxury, entirely distinct from the organized chaos of the market just beyond the walls. Peacocks, according to some accounts, wander these grounds freely, an imported luxury bird whose entire function seems to be looking expensive while making a considerable racket at inconvenient hours, not unlike certain modern celebrity pets kept purely for their decorative and status signaling value, rather than any practical purpose whatsoever. The Ptolemaic rulers governing from within these walls maintain a genuinely elaborate court culture. Foreign ambassadors received with careful ceremonial protocol, court poets and scholars occasionally summoned to entertain or advise, and a constant undercurrent of political maneuvering among advisors, family members, and rival claimants to the throne, since Ptolemaic succession disputes have a well-documented tendency to turn genuinely dramatic, occasionally involving assassination, exile, or considerably messier family arrangements than most modern royal families would consider publicly acceptable. Ever watched a particularly dramatic family inheritance dispute play out at a holiday dinner, tensions simmering just beneath a thin veneer of forced politeness? Ptolemaic palace politics operated on that exact same energy, just with considerably higher stakes and noticeably more poison involved. The royal family itself maintains, at least publicly, an image of divine or semi-divine authority, blending Greek concepts of kingship with older Egyptian pharaonic traditions that cast the ruler as a genuine intermediary between gods and mortals. Public appearances, when they happen, involve considerable ceremony, processions, formal dress, and a careful stage-managed distance between ruler and ordinary resident that reinforces this elevated status at every opportunity. Beyond the political theatre, the palace complex also houses considerable practical administration, scribes managing tax records, officials overseeing the grain distribution that keeps the wider empire fed, and the machinery of bureaucracy that actually keeps a kingdom this size functioning day to day. Considerably less glamorous work happening quietly behind the ornamental gardens and ceremonial guards that visitors like yourself actually notice first. You linger near the walls a while longer, catching fragments of distant music drifting from somewhere inside, before a guard's pointed glance makes clear that your loitering privileges have officially expired. Walking back toward the market's noise and chaos, you feel a small, genuine relief. Whatever this city's ordinary residents lack in palace gardens and peacocks, they also, mercifully, lack the accompanying family drama. Let's talk about death, because even in this thoroughly Greek-flavoured city, the old Egyptian traditions never went anywhere, and mummification remains a booming, highly specialised trade practiced just beyond the city walls. Egyptian funerary tradition holds that proper preservation of the body is essential for the deceased's journey into the afterlife, a belief that predates Alexandria's founding by thousands of years and continues largely unshaken despite the city's newer Greek cultural veneer. Workshops dedicated to embalming operate on the city's outskirts, staffed by specialists who have trained for years in the exacting, multi-step process, removing internal organs, treating the body with natron salt to draw out moisture, and eventually wrapping the preserved remains in layer upon layer of fine linen, a process that can stretch across many weeks from start to finish. The smell inside these workshops is genuinely distinctive, a mixture of natron salt, resins, and various preserving oils that clings to clothing and lingers in memory long after you've left the premises. A smell that embalmers themselves seem to have grown entirely accustomed to, the way any professional eventually stops noticing the specific occupational hazard that would floor a first-time visitor. Different tiers of service exist, depending on what a grieving family can afford. Elaborate treatment with fine linen wrappings, protective amulets tucked between the layers, and a beautifully painted coffin case for the wealthy. Considerably simpler and faster treatment for those with more modest means. A genuinely uncomfortable but historically accurate reminder that economic inequality follows people quite literally into the afterlife in this culture, just as it does in most others across history. Ever priced out funeral arrangements and been quietly startled by how many tiers of service exist, even for something as universal as death? Ancient Alexandrian embalmers ran essentially the same business model: tiered packages, add-on options, and a distinct correlation between how much you're willing to spend and how elaborate your journey into eternity ultimately looks. Greek residents living in Alexandria, interestingly, frequently adopt at least partial Egyptian funerary customs themselves, commissioning mummification for their own deceased family members, despite maintaining otherwise thoroughly Greek cultural identities in daily life. A genuine bit of practical cultural blending that suggests Egyptian burial tradition carried enough perceived spiritual authority that even skeptical outsiders found it prudent to hedge their bets. Better safe than sorry, apparently, applies just as readily to the afterlife as to anything else. Tomb decoration and burial goods vary considerably by wealth and background too. Wealthier tombs featuring elaborate painted scenes depicting the deceased's life and journey into the afterlife, along with genuine treasures, jewelry, small statuettes, and personal possessions considered necessary for a comfortable eternity. More modest burials make do with simpler grave goods, a few personal items, and perhaps a modest amulet for protection. The same basic spiritual concerns present regardless of budget, just executed with considerably less gold leaf involved. Funeral processions themselves involve genuine public ceremony. Professional mourners hired specifically to wail and lament with theatrical, practiced grief, musicians accompanying the procession, and family members walking behind the deceased toward their final resting place outside the city walls. The entire event functioning as both genuine grief and a public display of the family's status and devotion. You pass one such procession, moving slowly through a side street, the mourners' cries genuinely affecting, despite knowing full well they've been professionally hired for exactly this purpose, and find yourself unexpectedly moved anyway. grief, it turns out, doesn't much care whether the person expressing it is doing so for love or for payment. It sounds remarkably similar either way. Let's step back down to the docks, because Alexandria's entire fortune runs through this harbour. A churning economy of grain ships, spice traders, and sailors who have seen every port from here to India, and rank this one among the strangest. Grain forms the true backbone of this entire economy. The Nile's fertile floodplain producing surplus wheat in quantities that make Egypt, and Alexandria by extension, one of the ancient Mediterranean's single most important breadbaskets. Barges arrive constantly from upriver, unloading into vast granaries near the harbour, grain that will eventually feed not just the city itself, but in later centuries help sustain Rome's own enormous population, a dependency that would eventually give Egypt considerable geopolitical leverage far beyond what its size alone might suggest. Ever noticed how certain countries hold outsized global influence purely because they control a resource everyone else desperately needs? Ancient Egypt's grain surplus functioned exactly this way, a strategic asset worth considerably more than its weight in gold to anyone hoping to keep a large, hungry city fed. Beyond grain, the harbour handles an enormous volume of luxury trade goods, incense and myrrh from Arabia, ivory and exotic animals from further south along the African coast, silk, eventually arriving via long overland and sea routes connecting to India and beyond, and glassware manufactured right here in Alexandria's own workshops, since the city has developed a genuine reputation for producing some of the finest decorative glass anywhere in the ancient world. Sailors working these routes have often travelled distances that would impress even well-travelled modern tourists. Men who've seen the Red Sea, the Arabian coast, and occasionally ports considerably further east, swapping stories in harbour taverns about storms, pirates, and increasingly unbelievable sea creatures that grow noticeably larger with each retelling. Ship construction and repair happens constantly along the docks too. Carpenters and rope makers maintaining a fleet that ranges from small local fishing vessels to substantial merchant ships capable of the open water crossing to Rhodes, Athens, or further afield. The smell of pitch and fresh-cut timber mingles with the harbour's usual salt and fish, workers calling instructions back and forth as a hull gets recorked or a mast repaired. The whole operation running with the practiced efficiency of people who understand that a delayed ship means real money lost, not just inconvenience. Customs officials, scribes and tax collectors form their own substantial presence throughout this harbour economy, since the Ptolemaic administration takes a notably thorough interest in taxing virtually every transaction passing through, a bureaucracy detailed enough that ancient papyrus records survive, listing individual cargo manifests down to specific quantities and values. Ever filled out an excessively detailed customs declaration form at an airport, wondering who exactly reads all this information? Alexandria's tax scribes genuinely did read all of it, cross-referencing figures with the same dedication the library's scholars applied to comparing manuscript variants, just aimed at revenue rather than literature. Sailors themselves occupy a fairly rough and tumble social position, well-travelled and worldly, but not particularly wealthy or high status, their pay modest, and their working conditions genuinely dangerous. Storms, piracy, and simple maritime accidents claiming lives regularly enough that harbour-side shrines to protective sea deities receive steady, sincere offerings from crews about to depart on a long voyage. A little insurance, spiritual or otherwise, never hurts when your entire livelihood depends on the Mediterranean's genuinely unpredictable moods. Standing at the harbour's edge as the day's unloading winds down, watching lanterns being lit along the docks one by one, you understand that everything else this city has built, the library, the temples, the grand avenue, ultimately depends on this unglamorous, exhausting daily grind of loading and unloading cargo. Alexandria's intellectual glory floats, quite literally, on a foundation of very tired sailors. Let's talk about money, because a city this wealthy runs on a currency system as carefully managed as everything else here. And figuring out what a loaf of bread actually costs you involves more mental arithmetic than you'd like at this hour. The Ptolemaic Kingdom operates its own closed currency system. Silver and bronze coins minted specifically for use within Egypt, and notably different from the coinage circulating in the rest of the Greek Mediterranean world, meaning merchants arriving from Rhodes or Athens typically need to exchange their foreign currency for local coin before conducting any real business here. This isn't accidental inconvenience, it's deliberate economic policy. The Ptolemaic administration maintaining tight control over the kingdom's money supply and, not incidentally, taking a small cut on every currency exchange that happens as a result. Ever travelled abroad and been quietly stung by a currency exchange fee at the airport, watching your money shrink slightly for the simple crime of arriving somewhere new? Alexandrian money changers were running that same modest hustle over 2,000 years ago, minus the electronic exchange board. Daily transactions for most ordinary residents involve bronze coinage, small denominations suited to buying bread, a jug of wine, or a portion of fish at the market, while silver handles larger transactions, rent, significant purchases, or a merchant's wholesale dealings. Gold appears rarely in everyday commerce, reserved mostly for royal payments, major state transactions, or the kind of jewellery that signals serious wealth rather than practical spending money. A typical labourer's daily wage might afford basic bread, a modest quantity of vegetables, and perhaps a small portion of fish or cheese, meaning the actual gap between subsistence living and genuine comfort remains, as in most ancient economies, considerably wider than the city's glittering public image might suggest. Taxation touches nearly every aspect of commercial life here. A genuinely thorough bureaucratic system taxing land, trade goods, professional licenses, and even, according to surviving records, certain specific goods like beer and oil with their own dedicated levies. Scribes maintain meticulous records of these transactions, meaning the modern image of ancient Egypt as some loosely organised, informal economy couldn't be further from reality. This is a tightly administered fiscal machine, tracking revenue with a precision that would impress even a fairly demanding modern accountant. Ever complained about the sheer number of separate taxes and fees hidden inside a single utility bill? Ptolemaic Egypt would have found your bill charmingly straightforward by comparison. Banking, in a genuinely recognizable early form, operates here too. Private and state-run establishments accepting deposits, facilitating loans, and handling the kind of complex multi-party transactions that a purely cash-based system simply can't manage efficiently. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade particularly rely on these arrangements, since hauling large quantities of physical coin across the Mediterranean carries obvious risks that a properly documented financial arrangement helps mitigate considerably. Wealth inequality, unsurprisingly, remains stark and visible throughout the city. The gap between a dock worker scraping by on bronze coins and a wealthy merchant or palace official commanding vast silver and gold reserves, enormous and largely unbridgeable within a single generation. This is not a city offering much in the way of genuine economic mobility. Birth and circumstance determining, with fairly brutal consistency, exactly which tier of this elaborate financial system you're likely to occupy for the rest of your life. You count out a small handful of bronze coins for your evening meal, doing quick mental math on an exchange rate you still don't fully understand, and think that some anxieties, apparently, remain entirely unchanged, no matter how many centuries separate you from the person doing the counting. As the sun finally drops behind the lighthouse, Alexandria does not so much quiet down as change costumes. Its streets filling with music, lamplight, and a very different kind of crowd than the one you navigated all afternoon. Oil lamps flicker to life along the main thoroughfares and inside taverns, casting warm, uneven pools of light that barely reach the darker side alleys, meaning navigating the city after dark requires a genuinely different level of caution than the confident daytime stroll you'd grown accustomed to. Taverns fill quickly with dock workers, sailors freshly paid and eager to spend it, and off-duty scribes looking to unwind after a day spent hunched over tax records. The noise level rising steadily as wine flows and the evening's inevitable arguments about sports, politics, or a rival tavern's inferior beer begin working themselves into a genuine froth. Music drifts from multiple directions simultaneously. A lyre player performing for coins near a tavern entrance, competing directly with a small group further down the street, keeping time on hand drums, while someone attempts an ambitious, increasingly off-key vocal performance that draws a mixture of genuine appreciation and good-natured heckling from the gathered crowd. Street performers work the wider public spaces too. Acrobats, jugglers, and the occasional trained animal act, drawing crowds near the main avenue. Entertainment that costs whatever a viewer feels moved to toss into a waiting bowl, rather than any fixed admission price. Ever walked past a genuinely skilled street musician and found yourself lingering considerably longer than you'd planned, eventually digging through your pockets for spare change, despite having somewhere else to be? This exact dynamic, apparently, requires no modern city infrastructure whatsoever to function perfectly. For those with means, Private evening gatherings continue well past what the ordinary tavern crowd experiences. Symposiums stretching deep into the night. Philosophical debate gradually giving way to considerably looser conversation as the wine keeps flowing, and the designated symposiarch's careful dilution ratios become progressively less relevant to how the evening actually unfolds. Elsewhere, theatrical performances occasionally light up the city's public spaces too. Travelling troupes performing scenes from established Greek tragedy or comedy. Torchlit stages drawing crowds willing to stand for hours, watching familiar stories performed with fresh, sometimes genuinely inspired variation. The Serapeum and other major temples maintain a quieter, more contemplative nighttime presence. Incense still burning, a handful of devoted worshippers seeking guidance, or simply quiet reflection, away from the raucous energy filling the tavern district nearby. The sacred and the rowdy operating in close proximity, without much apparent conflict, each simply occupying its own corner of the city's after-dark personality. Watch officials patrol the main streets with modest torches and even more modest authority, mostly concerned with preventing outright violence or serious theft, rather than policing the genuinely enormous quantity of minor rowdy behaviour happening throughout the tavern district on any given night. A fairly reasonable division of enforcement priorities, given the sheer scale of what they'd otherwise be expected to manage. You finally settle onto a low wall near the harbour, the lighthouse's great beam still sweeping steadily overhead. Music and laughter drifting from the tavern district behind you, the black water lapping quietly at the docks below. Tomorrow, this city will return to its scholars, its scribes, and its endless, confident ambition. Tonight, at least, it simply wants to have a good time. And honestly, after everything you've witnessed today, so do you. And so our long night in ancient Alexandria comes gently to a close. You arrived tired and salt-streaked, blinking up at a lighthouse tall enough to make an entire city feel like a rounding error. And you leave, having wandered through more languages, more gods, and more arguments about geometry than any one traveller has any right to survive in a single day. You watched a library try to own every book in the world, and very nearly succeed. You stood beneath a temple built for a god invented on purpose, and felt the incense work on you anyway. You ate street food that burned your fingers, drank wine diluted by a stranger's careful judgment, and learned that a good customs official could confiscate your favourite book and hand you back a copy with a perfectly straight face. It was chaotic, and it was dazzling. And underneath all of it were real people, simply going about their lives in a city that happened to be a little more ambitious than most. Sailors hauling grain that fed an empire. Scribes recording every last transaction with a patience that still shows up on papyrus today. Scholars arguing over triangles with the same passion other people reserve for arguing about anything that actually matters. and somehow being right to do it. They built something that outlasted their own lifetimes by a couple of 1,000 years, and most of them never got to see how the story ended. So tonight, as you sink into your own quiet bed, with no lighthouse to guide you home, and no customs official waiting to confiscate your bedtime reading, maybe send a small, drowsy thank you to the people who built a city out of pure curiosity and questionable religious branding. Because travel, even the kind you only do in your own head at midnight, is proof that people everywhere have always been reaching for something a little larger than themselves. One scroll, one temple, one very confident lighthouse at a time. Let the harbour fade, let the torches burn low. Somewhere behind you, Alexandria keeps its light turning steadily out over black water, exactly as it always has, whether anyone is watching or not. Sleep well. The library will still be